Some men spend their whole lives chasing fortune. Others find it shivering on the porch in the rain. The wind came hard off Lake Ontario that night, rattling the eaves of the small cedar house at the edge of town. November in eastern Canada had a way of arriving without apology. One week you still smelled wet leaves and chimney smoke. The next, the cold moved in like unpaid debt. Graham Whitmore knew the sound of weather better than most people knew music. At 68, retired from the Kingston Police Service for nearly a decade, he could tell freezing rain from sleet by the rhythm it made on old wood. Tonight it was rain, sharp and relentless, tapping the porch rails, hissing across the gravel drive, sliding down the windows in silver lines. Inside, the house was warm but quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that settles after years of living alone. A kettle cooled on the stove. A lamp glowed beside a worn armchair. On the mantel sat a framed photograph of a younger Graham in dress uniform, standing straighter than age now allowed. At his feet, stretched across a braided rug, lay Bruno. The Doberman had once worked narcotics and tracking. Now he was gray around the muzzle, slower in the hips, but no less watchful. Some instincts retire later than men do. Bruno's ears lifted first. His head rose. Then came the low sound in his chest, not a bark, not yet, but a warning shaped like thunder. Graham looked up from his paperback. "What is it, old boy?" Bruno was already standing. He moved to the front door with surprising speed for a dog his age, nails ticking over hardwood, body rigid, eyes fixed on the narrow strip of darkness beneath the frame. Another growl. Then one hard bark that shook the room. Graham set the book aside. Bruno did not waste noise. Never had. He took the flashlight from the hook by the door, shrugged into his heavy flannel coat, and opened it to the wet night. Cold air rushed in carrying the smell of cedar, rain, and mud. The porch light revealed a shape collapsed near the steps. A man. Thin coat soaked through. One shoe missing. Fingers pale and curled against the boards. For half a second Graham froze, the old reflex of shock colliding with the older reflex to move. "Easy. Now," he said, more to himself than anyone else. He knelt carefully. The man was breathing, shallow and uneven, lips trembling from cold. Rainwater clung to his beard. He looked past 60, maybe more, though hardship makes calendars lie. Bruno stepped close, sniffed once, then gently touched the stranger's sleeve with his nose. No aggression. No fear. Just concern. "Call was yours," Graham murmured to the dog. He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed emergency services with steady fingers. Address given. Male unconscious but breathing. Possible hypothermia. Ambulance en route. Estimated 7 minutes. 7 minutes can be a long time in weather like this. Graham slid one arm beneath the man's shoulders and another under his knees. The stranger weighed almost nothing. Too light for a grown man. Bruno backed aside as Graham carried him in. Water dripped from the hem of the coat onto the floorboards. Inside, Graham laid him on the sofa, added blankets, then another. He turned on the gas fireplace and set the room aglow with soft orange heat. "Stay with me, friend," he said quietly. The man's eyes fluttered but did not open. Graham warmed towels in the dryer, placed them around the man's hands, then set a mug of hot water nearby for when he could swallow. Bruno sat beside the sofa like a sentry, gaze never leaving the stranger's face. The room smelled of wet wool, old pine, and rain carried in from the night. Minutes passed with the strange elasticity of emergencies. Then the man stirred. His eyes opened only halfway, cloudy but aware enough to search the room. They found Bruno first, then Graham. A weak smile touched his mouth. "Nice dog," he whispered, voice thin as paper. "Best officer in the house," Graham replied. The man's shaking hand fumbled inside his coat pocket. Graham leaned closer, thinking perhaps medication, perhaps identification. Instead, the stranger withdrew a crumpled lottery ticket, damp at the corners, folded and unfolded so many times it looked like cloth. He pressed it into Graham's palm with surprising urgency. "No," Graham said gently. "Keep it. You'll need your things." The man closed Graham's fingers over it. His own hand was freezing. "I got nothing else," he breathed. "Maybe luck forgot me, maybe it remembers you." Sirens sounded faintly in the distance, growing louder through the rain. Bruno's ears turned toward the road, but he did not move. Graham looked down at the ticket, then back at the man whose eyes were already slipping shut again. In 32 years wearing a badge, Graham had been handed confessions, lies, warrants, threats, wedding invitations, and once a pie from a grateful baker. But never this. Never a stranger's last hope folded small enough to fit inside one hand. The paramedics arrived in a wash of red light and rain reflections, their boots thudding across the porch boards with practiced urgency. Graham stepped back just enough to let them work, though Bruno did not move from his post beside the sofa until Graham touched his collar and gave a quiet command. The Doberman obeyed, but reluctantly, settling 2 meters away with eyes fixed on every hand that reached toward the stranger. One paramedic, a young woman with tired eyes and a calm voice, checked pulse, temperature, airway. The other unfolded a stretcher and asked the usual questions. Name. Age. Known medical conditions. Graham had no answers worth giving. "Found him outside about 10 minutes ago," he said. "Barely conscious. Severe cold exposure." They wrapped the man in heated blankets and moved with the efficiency that comes from doing difficult things often. As they lifted him, the stranger's hand drifted weakly through the air as if searching for something. Graham stepped forward instinctively, and the man's fingers found his sleeve. His eyes opened one last time. There was gratitude there, and something close to relief. Then the ambulance doors closed, and the sound of the siren faded down the wet road toward Kingston General Hospital. The silence afterward felt larger than the storm. Graham stood beneath the porch light, rain misting across the yard, the crumpled ticket still in his coat pocket. Bruno pressed against his leg once, then looked up as if asking the question neither of them could phrase. "I know," Graham said softly. "I know." Inside, the house carried traces of what had happened. Damp footprints on the floor. A blanket fallen half open. Steam still rising from the kettle he had forgotten to switch off. Graham cleaned by habit, not because mess bothered him, but because order was how some men held grief at bay. Bruno followed room to room, slower now, pausing often at the front window to watch the road. Near midnight, the hospital called. Their voices were gentle in the way professionals become when they have delivered hard truths too many times. The man had gone into cardiac distress en route. They had tried. He passed before arrival. There was a pause afterward in which both people on the line listened to the weather instead of each other. "Did he leave identification?" Graham finally asked. "No wallet. No phone. Nothing with a name." The nurse hesitated. "You were listed as the only contact because you called him in." After the call ended, Graham remained seated at the kitchen table long after the tea went cold. He had spent years meeting strangers on their worst nights. Domestic disputes, collisions on black ice, lonely deaths behind locked apartment doors. Yet this one settled differently. Perhaps because the man had arrived with nothing. Perhaps because he had still found something to give away. Bruno laid his chin on Graham's knee. The old dog's eyes were softer than people deserved. "We did what we could," Graham murmured, though it sounded less certain spoken aloud. Dawn came slowly, pale and silver over the maple trees. The storm had moved east, leaving gutters full and the world rinsed clean. Graham fed Bruno, shoveled the slush from the front steps, then noticed the lottery ticket still resting where he had placed it beside the bread box. Damp, wrinkled, ordinary. Ontario Lottery and Gaming logo faded at one corner. Draw date from 3 nights earlier. He almost threw it out. Then he remembered the stranger's hand closing his fingers around it with the last strength he had left. Maybe luck forgot me. Graham sat at the table and smoothed the paper as carefully as if it were a photograph. He found his reading glasses, switched on the radio, and opened the lottery results page on his laptop. Bruno, sensing importance where there was only stillness, came to sit beside him. Graham checked the first number once. Then again. He frowned and looked closer. Second number matched. Third. Fourth. By the fifth, something cold moved through him that had nothing to do with weather. He read each line twice more, then compared the ticket again with trembling precision learned from years of evidence reports. Every number matched. Bonus included. The prize amount sat at the bottom of the screen in clean digital lettering. $8 million. Graham removed his glasses and stared at the kitchen wall as though it might explain itself. Bruno gave a short, uncertain huff. No, Graham whispered to no one visible. That cannot be right. But the numbers did not change, and outside, the first news van had just turned onto his street. By 9 in the morning, Maple Street looked less like a neighborhood and more like the edge of a parade route. News vans lined the curb with satellite dishes raised toward a pale winter sky. Reporters in pressed coats rehearsed solemn expressions beside camera operators stamping warmth into their boots. Neighbors who usually waved once a week now stood in clusters at the sidewalk pretending to discuss weather while studying Graham's front porch with open fascination. Fortune, he thought, had a remarkable talent for making strangers curious. Graham closed the blinds halfway, enough to dim the room without surrendering it. Bruno sat beside the front window, ears forward, watching every movement outside with the serious concentration of a guard who had never accepted retirement. The dog's dark coat caught the morning light in polished lines, but age showed in the silver around his muzzle and the slower way he rose from the floor. You and me both, Graham said quietly. Too old for crowds. His phone had not stopped ringing. Local paper. National network. 2 former colleagues. One woman claiming to be a cousin of the deceased, though she could not provide the deceased man's name. Graham let each call expire into silence. He had already contacted Ontario Lottery and Gaming, who confirmed the ticket was genuine and instructed him not to sign anything until legal ownership could be reviewed. The woman on the line had sounded professional, almost cheerful, as if $8 million were simply another weather report. To Graham, it felt heavier than money should. He made coffee and found he could not drink it. On the kitchen table sat the ticket inside a clear freezer bag, flattened and dry now, beside a notepad covered in names and numbers. There were practical matters to address. Estate law. Police report. Identity of the deceased. Yet each task seemed built on the same unanswered question: who had the man been before the world forgot him? A hard knock struck the front door. Not polite. Certain. Bruno was there before the second knock landed, chest low, growl gathering deep as distant thunder. Graham rose, checked the side window first, then opened the door 2 inches width. The chain still fastened. A woman in a camel coat stood on the porch, hair styled against the wind, camera-ready grief on her face. Beside her waited a younger man holding flowers still wrapped in plastic. Mr. Whitmore, she asked warmly. I am Denise Fowler. I believe the man who passed may have been my uncle. You believe? Graham replied. Her smile thinned only slightly. Family situations can be complicated. So can trespassing. He closed the door before she found another sentence. Bruno gave one satisfied snort through his nose. Before noon, 2 more visitors came. One claimed the man had borrowed money years ago. Another said they had shared a shelter in Toronto and wanted to honor his memory on television. Graham trusted neither story nor timing. Money had already started changing the dead man into whatever the living needed him to be. By early afternoon, a reporter managed to catch him while he carried in firewood from the shed. "Mr. Whitmore, do you feel morally entitled to the winnings?" she called, microphone extended like a fishing rod. "Did the deceased understand the value of what he gave you?" Graham set the wood down slowly. "He understood kindness," he said. "That is more than I can say for everyone." He went back inside and locked the door. The line aired an hour later, trimmed to 6 seconds and framed by dramatic music. Bruno barked at the television once, offended by the edit. Graham switched it off. Near dusk, a black sedan rolled to the curb and remained idling. The driver did not hurry. A tall man stepped out in polished shoes unsuited for slush, carrying a leather briefcase under one arm. Mid-40s. Expensive coat. Smile measured to the millimeter. He walked to the porch with the confidence of someone accustomed to entering rooms he had not been invited into. Bruno was already standing before the knock came. Not barking this time. Worse. Silent, rigid, eyes fixed. Graham opened the door without removing the chain. "Mr. Whitmore," the man said smoothly. "My name is Derek Caldwell. I represent the lawful next of kin of the deceased gentleman. We need to discuss immediate transfer of the ticket." He produced a business card as if unveiling authority itself. Graham did not take it. "You know his name, then?" "In due time." "Funny," Graham said. "I was about to ask the same of you." Bruno's growl rolled low and steady, but it was not aimed at Caldwell's face. It was aimed lower, toward the leather briefcase and the old canvas backpack resting just inside the hallway, the one paramedics had left behind with the stranger's few belongings. Caldwell's eyes flickered to the bag for half a second. It was enough. Dogs notice what people hide. Graham noticed Bruno noticing. And suddenly, the room felt colder than the weather outside. Caldwell's smile held for another second, then adjusted itself into something more legal than human. "I understand your caution, Mr. Whitmore," he said. "These matters often become emotional." Graham kept one hand on Bruno's collar, though the dog had not moved an inch. "Funny," Graham replied. "You came to my door asking for a dead man's property and chose the word emotional." The lawyer's eyes flicked once more toward the old canvas backpack resting beside the umbrella stand. It was faded green, patched at one corner, with rain still drying along the seams. Nothing about it suggested value. Yet Bruno's gaze never left it, and neither now did Graham's instincts. Caldwell cleared his throat. "My clients are grieving. They wish only to settle affairs with dignity." "Then tell me his name." A pause, thin and sharp. "We believe it was Harold Bennett." "Believe again," Graham said. "You represent family but do not know for certain who died." The lawyer's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Men like him practiced calm the way athletes practice balance. Identification can be difficult in these unfortunate circumstances. So can honesty. Graham closed the door before the man could answer. Through the wood came one measured knock, then retreating footsteps over wet boards. Bruno remained fixed on the entrance long after the sedan pulled away. Only when its engine faded did he turn and walk straight to the backpack. He lowered his head, sniffed along the zipper, then gave a low growl unlike the one he used for strangers. This was different. Focused. Certain. "All right," Graham said quietly. "Show me." He carried the bag to the kitchen table and unzipped it slowly. The smell of damp fabric, old tobacco, and cedar drifted out. Inside were the small remains of a life reduced to what could be carried. 2 pairs of socks folded with care. A worn wool scarf. A paperback missing its front cover. A toothbrush in a cracked plastic case. 3 envelopes addressed nowhere, never mailed. Graham opened the first. Blank paper inside. The second held a pressed maple leaf, brittle with age. The third contained a photograph of a woman in her 50s, smiling beside a garden fence in summer light. On the back, written in careful blue ink, were 2 words, "For June." Bruno nudged the side pocket with his nose. Graham checked it and found a bus pass expired 3 years earlier, a church soup kitchen card, and a small brass key attached to a tag stamped with a number, C-17. No name. No address. Just the number. Locker key? Graham wondered aloud. Bruno sat back but kept staring into the open bag as if the answer had not been reached yet. Graham searched deeper, running his hand along the lining. His fingers touched something stiff sewn between layers of fabric. He took a pocketknife, cut a loose seam carefully, and slid out a narrow folded slip of paper wrapped in waxed plastic. Inside was a cemetery map of St. Andrew's Memorial Grounds on the east side of town. One section had been circled in red ink. Plot C-17. Graham looked at the brass key, then at Bruno. Well now. Outside, darkness settled early, as it does in Ontario once winter begins rehearsing. Snow threatened in the clouds though none had fallen yet. Graham called an old friend from the service, retired Constable Neil Mercer, who still knew how to ask quiet questions in loud places. Neil answered on the second ring. If this is about hockey, I am busy. It is about a dead man, a lottery ticket, and a lawyer with expensive shoes. Silence, then a sigh. I will put the kettle on. 40 minutes later Neil sat at the kitchen table, broad-shouldered and silver-haired, rubbing Bruno's ears while studying the key and cemetery map. Caldwell, he said at last. I know the name. Civil litigation. Estate disputes. Wins often enough to afford arrogance. Can he simply take the ticket? Graham asked. Not without proof. Neil tapped the map. But he may be looking for something better than proof. They both looked at the backpack. Graham thought of Caldwell's eyes landing there before anything else. Not the ticket. Not the man who died. The bag. Then we go before he does, Graham said. Neil smiled grimly. That sounds like the first sensible sentence I have heard all day. Near midnight, after Neil left, Graham set the key beside the photograph of the smiling woman. Bruno lay by the door, awake despite the hour. Wind brushed the windows with dry fingers. Somewhere beyond town, among rows of stone and sleeping names, a numbered place waited in the dark. And whatever Harold Bennett had hidden there had frightened a lawyer more than $8 million ever could. Morning arrived colorless and sharp, the kind of Ontario dawn that made rooftops shine with frost and every breath visible. Graham had slept little. Some nights the past kept men awake. Others, it was the future. He poured coffee into a travel mug, packed 2 flashlights, gloves, and the cemetery map into an old canvas satchel, then clipped Bruno's lead to his collar. The Doberman stood before the door already alert, tail still, body carrying the quiet readiness he had once brought to search warrants and missing persons calls. Just like old times, Graham murmured. Bruno glanced back as if to say they had never ended. St. Andrew's Memorial Ground sat on the eastern edge of Kingston where the city thinned into fields and bare maples. It was older than most living memory, founded when names were carved deeper and grief was worn more privately. Rows of granite markers rose through pale grass silvered with frost. Crows moved between cedars like scraps of shadow. Graham parked beside the iron gate just after 7. Neil Mercer was already there in his pickup, hands in pockets, scarf pulled high against the cold. You look terrible, Neil said. You look retired, Graham replied. They shook hands the way men do when affection must disguise itself as insult. Bruno stepped down from the truck and sniffed the wind, then immediately pulled toward the older section of the grounds. That settles route planning, Neil said. They followed a narrow path lined with weathered stones and names softened by time. Snow flurries drifted briefly, then vanished. Plot markers moved from A to B, then into the sea rose where the ground sloped gently toward a stand of spruce. Graham checked the map. C-17 lay near the far edge beside a low stone wall mottled with moss. The headstone there was modest, gray granite, well kept despite the season. June Bennett. Beloved wife, teacher, gardener, light in every room. Beneath the date someone had engraved a final line in smaller letters, still with me. Graham removed his gloves. He came here often, he said quietly. Neil nodded. Looks that way. Fresh candle wax marked the base. A small tin cup held last week's dead chrysanthemums. The earth nearby showed signs of careful sweeping where leaves had been cleared by hand. Bruno circled once, then sat beside the stone with an unusual softness, ears lowered, gaze fixed on the wall behind it. Graham followed the dog's line of sight. Half hidden by ivy and frost stood a maintenance alcove built into the stone boundary, little more than an old recess where groundskeepers once stored tools. Set into the wooden panel was a rusted lock marked C-17. Graham looked at the brass key from the backpack. Well, Harold, he said, you did leave directions. The key resisted at first, then turned with a tired click. Inside the alcove were no tools. Instead, wrapped in plastic sheeting and tucked carefully away from damp, rested a metal biscuit tin, a folded blanket, and a stack of books tied with twine. Bruno gave one short huff, satisfied. Neil lifted the tin onto the stone ledge and opened it. Inside lay documents sealed in freezer bags, old photographs, and a black notebook worn smooth at the corners. Graham opened the notebook first. On the inside cover, written in neat teacher's handwriting, were the words, Harold Bennett. If found, please read with kindness. The pages that followed were dated over many years. Some entries were brief. Some stretched for several pages. They told of classrooms, students who still sent Christmas cards, evenings spent caring for June through chemotherapy, selling the family cottage near Gananoque, then the house, then the car. One line sat heavier than the others. Love costs everything only to those who count wrongly. Graham turned another page. The handwriting changed there, shakier now. Sons visited today. Asked about insurance before asking about their mother. Neil exhaled through his nose. Neither man spoke. Another entry months later read, June gone. House gone. Boys gone too. I hope bitterness is colder than this bench because then it punishes itself. Graham closed the book for a moment and stared across the cemetery where morning light touched the stones one by one. He was a teacher, he said. And they let him vanish. Neil looked into the tin again and found several lottery stubs. Carefully dated week after week. Tucked beneath them was a single note written recently in trembling script. If one ever wins, it belongs to the first soul who helps without asking why. Graham felt the cold reach somewhere deeper than skin. Bruno moved closer and rested his head against Graham's thigh. In the distance, tires crunched over gravel at the front gate. A dark sedan had just entered the cemetery road. Neil glanced up. Tell me that is a grieving relative. Graham already knew better. Even from 50 meters away, polished shoes have a certain shine. The sedan rolled slowly between the rows of stone as if even impatience knew to lower its voice in a cemetery. Frost cracked beneath its tires. When it stopped 20 meters away, Derek Caldwell stepped out in a charcoal coat, leather gloves, and the same measured expression he wore at Graham's front door. Two others followed him this time, a man and woman in their 40s dressed in expensive grief. They looked around not with sorrow, but with assessment. Some people visit burial grounds to remember. Others come to calculate. Mr. Whitmore, Caldwell called pleasantly, walking toward them. You continue to surprise me. Neil Mercer folded his arms. Likewise. The lawyer's eyes moved to the open tin, the notebook, then the freezer bag stacked beside June Bennett's stone. For the first time, the smile thinned into something real and sharp. Those materials belong to the estate, he said. I advise you not to interfere further. Graham remained where he stood, one hand resting lightly on Bruno's neck. Interesting, he said. Yesterday you did not know the man's name. Today you know the contents of a hidden box. Caldwell ignored the remark. He gestured toward the pair behind him. These are Harold Bennett's children. Susan and Mark Bennett. They are devastated by recent events. The woman lowered her eyes on cue. The man gave a nod practiced enough to suggest rehearsal. Neither looked at their mother's grave. Neither looked at the notebook. Bruno did. His ears rose. Then the old Doberman stepped forward and fixed his stare on Mark Bennett's coat pocket. A low growl began deep in his chest, steady as distant thunder over water. Mark instinctively took one step back. Control your dog, Caldwell said sharply. He usually controls himself around honest people, Graham replied. Neil coughed into a laugh. Caldwell's jaw set. My clients have suffered enough. Their father disappeared years ago due to mental decline. They searched tirelessly. Graham picked up the notebook and opened to a bookmarked page. Would you like me to read from October 12, 6 years ago? He cleared his throat. Boys came today. Asked if I would sign over the house before winter. Said care homes are cheaper than heating bills. Silence moved across the frosted grass. Susan Bennett looked suddenly at the sky. Mark swore under his breath. Caldwell stepped in smoothly. Private writings of an unwell man prove nothing. Graham turned another page. March 3rd. Saw Susan downtown. She crossed the street rather than say hello. He looked up. Should I continue? The woman's eyes filled, but not with grief. With embarrassment. This is harassment, Caldwell snapped. No, Neil said quietly. This is reading. Caldwell reached toward the tin. Bruno's bark split the morning like a struck bell. The lawyer froze mid-step. Birds rose from the cedars in a scatter of wings. Even the crows sounded offended. Graham's voice stayed calm. You will not touch anything here. For a moment the lawyer's polished confidence slipped, revealing anger beneath. You think a dog and a notebook will decide ownership of $8 million? No, Graham said. I think truth might. Mark Bennett suddenly spoke, voice brittle with cold and nerves. He was impossible after Mum died. Angry all the time. We had our own families. Graham looked at June Stone, then back at him. So did he. Susan wiped at her face. We sent money sometimes. Neil lifted one of the envelopes from the tin and held it up. All were addressed in Harold's hand to his children. All returned unopened. The stamps still clean. Susan said nothing after that. Wind moved through the spruce trees with the sound of old paper turning. Caldwell adjusted his gloves, recovering tone if not composure. Very moving. Nevertheless, legal next of kin remain legal next of kin. My office will seek injunction and immediate transfer of all assets. He glanced once more at the notebook, then at Graham. Enjoy the sympathy while it lasts. He turned and walked back toward the sedan. The Bennett siblings followed more slowly, their expensive boots slipping slightly on frost. Halfway there, Susan stopped and looked back at the grave. She opened her mouth as if words might finally come, then closed it. Again and kept walking. Bruno watched until the car disappeared through the gate. Only then did he relax. Neil exhaled long and low. That man is dangerous. Graham closed the notebook and placed it carefully back in the tin. No, he said. Just hungry. He looked at June Bennett Stone, at the line still with me carved beneath her name. Some love survive death. Some failures survive comfort. In the pocket of Caldwell's departing client, Bruno had smelled something else entirely. Graham had seen it too for one brief second when the coat shifted open. A folded document with the Ontario Lottery logo peeking from the edge. By the time Graham and Neil returned to Maple Street, the story had already grown teeth. 2 camera crews waited across from the driveway. A radio host's van sat idling with its logo bright as a carnival sign. Someone had posted a printed sheet on the community board near the mailbox that read "Greet has an address." Wind worried the corners loose. Graham parked without comment. Bruno, however, stared through the windshield with the unimpressed look of a veteran officer reviewing rookies. "Do not bite anyone with a microphone," Graham said. "Even if invited." Inside the house, warmth met them first, then the blinking light of the answering machine, then the ringing telephone that started again before either man removed a coat. Neil picked up. "No, he will not be joining your panel discussion. No, he is not hiding assets. No, I do not care what your listeners think." He hung up and unplugged the machine entirely. "Therapeutic," he said. Graham set the tin and notebook on the kitchen table like sacred things. He brewed fresh coffee, then spread the contents carefully beneath the lamp. Lottery stubs in dated rows. June's photograph. Returned letters. Notes written in a hand that had remained neat long after life became cruel. Bruno lay beside the table but did not sleep. Every time tires slowed outside, one ear lifted. "He smelled something on that man," Graham said. Neil nodded. "Or on the sun." Lottery logo in Mark Bennett's pocket. "I saw the movement after you mentioned it." Neil rubbed his jaw. "Could be a claim form. Could be another ticket. Could be nothing." Graham shook his head. Bruno does not growl at nothing. They spent the next hour reading Harold's journal in full. The entries painted years. With painful restraint. Teaching history at a secondary school. Summer trips with June to Prince Edward County. 2 children who once built snow forts and later built distance. Then illness. Bills. Selling the cottage, then the house, then dignity, one receipt at a time. A final set of entries appeared more recent, shaky but clear. Bought my weekly ticket again. Habit is the last luxury of the poor. Another page. Sat outside diner on Princess Street. Nice waitress gave extra soup. Good people still exist in pockets. Another. If I win, I will not reward blood. I will reward kindness. Neil leaned back slowly. That line alone matters. Graham turned the next page and stopped. Folded inside was a receipt from a convenience store dated 4 days earlier. 2 lottery tickets purchased at 8:12 p.m., too. Neil said. Graham examined the numbers. One matched the winning draw printed on the ticket Harold gave him. The second serial line ended differently. He bought 2 tickets that night. Bruno rose instantly, tail rigid, and walked to the front door. 3 sharp knocks followed. Not loud this time. Certain. Graham opened the inner door but kept the storm door latched. Mark Bennett stood on the porch alone, collar up against the cold, face pale with something more than weather. I need to speak with you, he said. Without the lawyer. Neil moved into view behind Graham. That can be arranged from the sidewalk. Mark swallowed. I made a mistake. Bruno's growl started low, but not hostile. Warning. Try honesty first, Graham said. Mark looked past them into the warm house and seemed briefly ashamed by wanting entry he had not earned. My father came to see me 3 nights ago, he said. He asked for a place to stay. I said no. Snow began drifting through the porch light in thin white lines. Then what? Graham asked. Mark reached into his coat slowly. Bruno stiffened but held position. Mark removed a folded paper slip. Another lottery ticket. He dropped this when he left. I found it later. Neil took it through the gap and checked the numbers against the receipt. It was the second ticket. Not a winner. Mark's shoulders sank. Caldwell told me if we claimed confusion over which ticket was which, we could freeze everything and force a settlement. The room went still enough to hear the furnace click on. And you agreed? Graham asked. Mark stared at the porch boards. At first. His voice cracked on the second word. Then I read one of the letters in the tin when Susan showed me a photo online. He wrote every birthday. Every Christmas. We never opened them. Bruno's growl faded. Dogs sometimes know remorse when people barely do. Neil looked at Graham. If he signs a statement, Caldwell's leverage weakens. Mark nodded quickly. I will sign whatever is true. Graham studied the man before him. Not redeemed. Not yet. But cracked open enough for light to test the edges. He stepped aside and unlatched the door. Come in, he said. Leave your excuses outside. Mark Bennett stood in Graham's kitchen as if warmth itself accused him. Snow melted from his shoulders onto the mat by the door. He kept his gloves in both hands, twisting the leather slowly, the habit of a man who had run out of language years before and only just noticed. Bruno watched from beside the table, alert but no longer hostile. The Doberman's judgment had softened by 1 degree, which was more mercy than many humans offered. Graham placed a legal pad before Mark and slid over a pen. Start with facts, he said. Leave drama to television. Mark nodded and sat carefully, eyes drifting once to the notebook that held his father's handwriting. He looked away quickly, as if it burned. 3 nights ago, he began, my father came to my condo in Ottawa. I had not seen him in almost 2 years. He was thinner. Colder. He asked if he could stay until morning. His voice thinned on the memory. I told him my building had rules. That I had meetings early. Neil Mercer gave a low sound that was not quite a laugh. Buildings do love rules. Mark continued, shoulders sinking. He said he understood. Then he reached into his coat and showed me 2 lottery tickets. He joked that if one won, he would buy a cabin and never bother me again. Graham said nothing. Silence can be kinder than commentary when shame is already doing its work. After he left, I found 1 ticket near the elevator. I kept it. Mark swallowed. The next day I heard a man had died in Kingston and given away a winning ticket. Caldwell contacted my sister first. He said because our father lacked capacity. An identification, the transfer could be challenged. He said if we presented ourselves as loving children deprived by a stranger, public sympathy would pressure a settlement. Neil leaned back in his chair. A charming strategy. Mark signed the bottom of the page and pushed it forward. I was going to go through with it. Then Susan sent me photos from the cemetery. The letters. The journal. I realized we had already taken enough. Graham read the statement once, then handed it to Neil. Outside, a reporter shouted something into the wind. No one inside bothered to hear it. Where is your sister now? Graham asked. At Caldwell's office, I think. She still believes money can repair humiliation. Graham looked at Harold's notebook. Money repairs furnaces. Roofs. Sometimes teeth. It does not repair character. Mark accepted the blow without protest. Bruno rose, walked to him, and sniffed his hand. After a moment, the dog turned away. Probation, not pardon. By noon, Neil had arranged a meeting with a probate solicitor he trusted in downtown Kingston. The office smelled of paper, coffee, and winter boots drying near radiators. Ms. Claire Donnelly was in her early 50s, sharp-eyed, practical, and immune to theatrics. She read the statement, examined the journal entries, and reviewed the timeline from ambulance call to lottery verification. This is stronger than sentiment, she said. It is intent. She tapped Harold's note, reward kindness. Canadian courts care about evidence more than outrage, though not always by much. She advised Graham to secure all documents, avoid media, and prepare for an injunction hearing within days. Caldwell will argue vulnerability, confusion, undue influence. Graham raised an eyebrow. I offered the man tea and an ambulance. Then let us hope civility remains legal, she replied. As they left the office, snow had thickened over Princess Street, muting traffic and storefront lights. Bruno trotted beside Graham with the dignified gait of an old officer on familiar pavement. Halfway to the truck, a woman called his name. Susan Bennett stood under an awning across the street, face bare to the cold, no makeup now, no staged grief. She crossed carefully through slush and stopped 2 meters away. Mark told me what he signed, she said. Good, Graham replied. I came to ask if there were letters for me too. Graham studied her for a long moment, then reached into the satchel and handed her one. Unopened envelope from the tin. Her name, written by Harold's hand, curved neatly across the front. She stared at it as if seeing her childhood returned in paper form. I do not deserve this, she whispered. That has never stopped gifts before, Graham said. Tears came then, sudden and unguarded. She did not open the letter there. She simply held it against her coat like something warm. Across the street, inside a parked sedan half covered in snow, Derek Caldwell watched the exchange through dark glass. Bruno stopped walking, turned his head, and stared directly at the car until it drove away. The next 48 hours turned winter mean. Snow piled against porch steps, wind carved white lines across roads, and every local station seemed to discover a fresh appetite for outrage. Graham Whitmore's face appeared beneath headlines asking whether compassion had become convenience. Commentators debated motives from heated studios while a man who had actually opened his door to the cold split firewood in silence. Bruno watched the television once, then chose the window instead. He had always preferred real threats to imagined ones. Claire Donnelly filed their response before sunrise on the second day. Affidavits from paramedics. Graham's emergency call log. Statements from 2 neighbors who saw him carry Harold inside and heard him asking dispatch to hurry. Mark Bennett signed confession regarding Caldwell's pressure tactics. Susan Bennett, after reading her father's unopened letter through the night, had sent her own statement by morning. It was brief and devastating. We abandoned him long before he died. Graham read it twice, then placed it beside Harold's notebook. Truth sometimes arrives late, but it still knows the address. That afternoon Claire called. Emergency hearing tomorrow at 9:30 in Kingston. Caldwell seeks injunction freezing the prize and alleging exploitation. Can he prove it? Graham asked. Proof and confidence are distant cousins, she said. He has one of them. The courthouse stood downtown near the harbor, its limestone front dusted with fresh snow and old authority. Graham wore his only suit, dark navy, pressed the night before. It fit a little looser than it once had. Bruno could not enter the courtroom, but Claire had arranged permission for him to wait in a side office with a court security supervisor who turned out to be a former handler. Good dog, the man said after one glance. Better than most lawyers. Graham left. Bruno with a pat between the ears. Guard the honor of the house, he said. The Doberman blinked solemnly. Inside, courtroom 3 smelled of paper, wool coats, and radiator heat. Caldwell was already there, immaculate as ever, flanked by Susan and Mark Bennett. Susan looked pale but steady. Mark stared at the table. Caldwell's confidence dimmed when he saw both siblings seated behind Claire instead of beside him. It dimmed further when Mark slid a copy of his statement across the aisle without a word. Proceedings began with the measured choreography of law. Caldwell spoke first, voice smooth and sorrowful. He described Harold as vulnerable, confused, manipulated by circumstance. He suggested Graham had failed to seek immediate aid, then accepted a valuable item from a dying man lacking capacity. He used the phrase opportunistic beneficiary twice, likely because he enjoyed it. Graham listened without expression. Some men lie with fists. Others with vowels. Claire rose next. She was not theatrical. She was precise, which is harder to defeat. She walked the judge through the timeline minute by minute. Emergency call placed within moments of discovery. Paramedics confirming warming measures already underway. No discussion of money. No knowledge of winning status until the next morning. Then she introduced Harold's journal and the note regarding rewarding kindness. This was not a transfer under pressure, she said. It was a deliberate act consistent with repeated written intention. Caldwell objected to hearsay. The judge overruled him with the kind of politeness that still stings. Then came Mark Bennett. He testified quietly, eyes lowered, about refusing his father's shelter and later being coached to challenge ownership. Caldwell's face remained composed, but one hand tightened on his pen. Susan followed. She read aloud from the letter Harold had written her months earlier and never mailed. My dear Susan, I hope life has been kinder to you than we were to each other. If you ever need forgiveness, know that I carried some ready for you. The room changed after that. Even radiators seemed to listen. Caldwell attempted recovery, questioning authenticity, timing, emotional relevance. It landed like snow on warm stone. At recess, Graham sat alone on a bench in the corridor, hands folded, hearing only the distant shuffle of boots and the muted harbor wind beyond the windows. A clerk approached. Your dog is causing a small sensation downstairs, she said. How? Graham asked. He refused. To let Mr. Caldwell retrieve his briefcase until security inspected it. Graham almost smiled. And? They found documents marked draft settlement agreement, signed only by him, assigning 40% of recovered funds to his firm. She paused. Security also found 3 unopened letters addressed to the Bennett siblings in the same briefcase. He had taken them from cemetery evidence photos. Graham looked toward the stairwell where Bruno waited somewhere below, old and stubborn and still impossible to bribe. Good boy, he said softly to no one present. When court resumed, Caldwell's chair was empty for the first 10 minutes. When Derek Caldwell finally returned, the shine had left him. Snow clung to the shoulders of his coat where before there had only been polish. He carried no briefcase. A court officer followed 2 steps behind and handed the judge a sealed envelope before taking position near the wall. In old buildings, justice often enters quietly. The judge adjusted her glasses, read the contents, and looked over the bench with the measured disappointment reserved for adults who should know better. Mr. Caldwell, she said, before we continue, this court has received notice of a professional conduct complaint and evidence of attempted contingent self-enrichment not previously disclosed. The room became very still. Caldwell rose. Your Honor, I can explain. That is often the opening line of people who cannot. Even Claire Donnelly allowed herself the smallest smile. The judge ordered Caldwell to step aside as counsel pending review. Another solicitor from his firm, summoned in haste and visibly unhappy to be present, took the table in his place. The man looked at the file as though it might be contagious. Without Caldwell's voice shaping every sentence, the Bennett claim lost most of its posture. What remained was thin and tired. The replacement counsel conceded there was no evidence Graham had known the ticket was a winner when he accepted it, no evidence of coercion, and no challenge to the authenticity of Harold's handwritten note or journal entries. He did attempt one final argument based on family entitlement and intestacy principles. Claire answered with calm precision. This is not a forgotten bank account discovered after death. It is a completed gift made with clear intent, delivered physically, witnessed by circumstances, and consistent with repeated writings. She paused. Family ties do not nullify generosity simply because money arrived later. The judge nodded once. Then. She asked Graham to stand. He did, hands at his sides, posture old habit more than ceremony. Mr. Whitmore, she said, did you ask for compensation, reward, or property of any kind on the night in question? No, Your Honor. Did you know the value of the ticket? No, Your Honor. Why did you bring Mr. Bennett into your home? Graham considered the question longer than expected. Outside the tall courthouse windows, snow moved sideways across the harbor. Because he was cold, he said at last. No one wrote for several seconds. The judge turned to Susan and Mark Bennett. Do either of you contest the evidence presented by your own statements? Susan rose first. Her voice shook, but it did not fail. No, Your Honor. We failed our father. Mr. Whitmore did not. Mark stood beside her. I agree. There are moments when defeat sounds almost like healing. The ruling came 20 minutes later. The injunction request was denied. The court recognized the lottery ticket as a valid inter vivos gift, voluntarily transferred by Harold Bennett to Graham Whitmore before death. Claims of undue influence were dismissed. Costs associated with frivolous escalation were reserved pending review of counsel conduct. It was careful legal language for something simpler. Greed had arrived late and empty-handed. Reporters rushed for the doors before the judge had fully risen. Claire closed her folder and leaned toward Graham. Congratulations, she said. You have won both a fortune and several weeks of inconvenience. He gave the faintest laugh. I preferred retirement. Downstairs, the corridor filled quickly with microphones and winter coats. Court security opened a side door and Bruno trotted out beside the former handler, nails clicking over stone tile, ears high, expression grave as a mounted officer. The crowd parted instinctively. Some authority needs no uniform. A reporter called, Mr. Whitmore, what will you do with $8 million? Another shouted, do you forgive the family? Graham clipped Bruno's lead and looked first at Susan and Mark standing uncertainly near the wall. Susan held the letter her father had written, folded now at the edges from rereading. Mark looked like a man carrying bricks no one else could see. Forgiveness is not mine to issue, Graham said. That belongs to the man who wrote to them anyway. He then looked at the cameras. As for the money, it came from someone the world overlooked. It should go back to people the world overlooks. By evening, every station in Ontario carried the clip. Donations offers began before sunset. A veterans group called. Then an animal rescue. Then a church shelter coordinator. Graham returned home through streets lit amber by snowplows and dusk. Inside, the house was warm, quiet, familiar. He hung his coat, set the court papers on the table, and stood for a moment listening to nothing urgent at all. Bruno walked to Harold's photograph beside June's note and sat down facing it. Graham joined him. You troublesome old detective, he murmured. Bruno thumped his tail once. Some dogs fetch balls. Others fetch the truth. The morning after the ruling, Maple Street woke to a different kind of traffic. No satellite vans. No shouted accusations. Instead, pickup trucks from local tradespeople rolled past slowly, drivers raising gloved hands in greeting. Someone had cleared Graham's sidewalk before sunrise. A loaf of fresh bread sat on the porch beside a handwritten note that read, for doing the decent thing. In small towns, apologies are often delivered as baked goods. Graham stood at the kitchen window with coffee in hand and watched snow fall in patient flakes across the cedar fence. Bruno leaned against his leg, warm and steady. The old Doberman had slept deeply for the first time in days, paws twitching now and then as if still chasing dishonest men through dreams. You earned your pension yesterday, Graham said. Bruno opened one eye, unconvinced retirement had ever applied to him. Calls began just after 8. A veterans outreach coordinator from Belleville asking if Graham truly meant what he said outside court. A rescue group near Peterborough wondering whether retired service dogs could be included in whatever he planned. A woman from Thunder Bay who ran a church kitchen and offered $20 with an apology that it was not more. Graham wrote every name down. By noon, the legal victory had become something larger than ownership. It had become permission for other people to be generous too. Claire Donnelly arrived shortly after lunch carrying folders, snow on her boots, and the practical energy of a woman who preferred action to celebration. "If you intend to do this properly," she said, laying papers across the table, "you will need a trust, governance, insurance, zoning review, and enough patience to survive committee meetings." Graham looked at the stack. "I nearly missed the lawsuit." "Do not be dramatic," she said. "That is Caldwell's department. They discussed properties for sale on the outskirts of Kingston. Old inns. Closed motels. A decommissioned training facility outside Napanee." Then Claire slid forward a listing no one else had wanted. "A former roadside lodge on 6 acres north of town. Structurally sound. Neglected. Large kitchen. Kennel outbuildings. Accessible main floor. Price reduced after 2 failed buyers." Graham studied the photographs. Weathered brick. Wide porch. Maple trees. Enough space for privacy without exile. "This one," he said. Bruno placed a paw on the page as if voting. By late afternoon they drove out to see it. The road wound through open farmland where drifts had gathered against fences and barns leaned wisely into the wind. The lodge stood back from the highway, quiet beneath white branches, windows clouded but unbroken. Inside, dust and cold met them first, then possibility. A stone fireplace large enough to anchor winter. 10 modest rooms along one corridor. A commercial kitchen needing work but not miracles. Behind the building, fenced runs once used for sled dogs decades earlier. Bruno moved room to room with solemn inspection, pausing longest in the old common hall where sunlight spilled across pine floors. He turned once in a slow circle, then lay down in the center of the room. "Approval granted," Claire said. Graham could almost see it then. Beds made warm. Soup on the stove. Older men and women with nowhere left to be unwelcome. Retired police dogs, military dogs, guide dogs whose handlers had passed, all given one final post where loyalty still counted. "We buy it," he said. The paperwork moved faster than expected. Sellers who had ignored lower offers suddenly accepted fair ones when they learned the purpose. A local contractor volunteered labor at cost. Electricians offered weekends. A hardware store donated paint. News of Harold Bennett traveled farther than Graham ever would have chosen for himself, and somehow each retelling brought another pair of hands. That evening, Graham drove alone to St. Andrew's Memorial Grounds with Bruno in the back seat. Snow had softened every stone. He carried no flowers, only the black notebook wrapped in a dry cloth. At June Bennett's grave, he brushed powder from the inscription and set the notebook gently at the base. "I borrowed your words," he said into the cold. They helped. Bruno sat beside him, ears lowered in that rare posture he reserved for churches and funerals. Graham looked at the line beneath June's name. "Still with me." "You were right," he murmured. "She is." Wind moved lightly through the cedars. Somewhere in town, strangers were discussing grants and building permits because one homeless teacher had refused to let bitterness be the last chapter. Graham stood there longer than the weather required. When he finally turned to leave, he noticed something tucked behind the stone, dry beneath the ledge. Another envelope in Harold's hand, overlooked by snow and shadow. Across the front, written carefully in blue ink, were 4 words. "For the man listening." The envelope felt lighter than it should have. Paper often does when it carries the weight of someone gone. Graham turned it over beneath the pale cemetery sky. No stamp. No seal beyond a careful fold tucked into itself. Harold's handwriting ran steady across the front despite the tremor of his later years. "For the man listening." Bruno sat close enough that his shoulder touched Graham's leg, the old Doberman watching the trees, the road, the empty places between stones where memory likes to move. Graham opened the letter slowly so the cold would not crack it. Inside was a single page, written on lined notebook paper in blue ink. If you are reading this, then kindness reached farther than I hoped. I have spent years learning that hunger is not the worst thing a man can carry. Being unseen is worse. Thank you for seeing me before I disappeared. Graham read the first lines twice before continuing. I suspect by now luck may have embarrassed itself and chosen strange timing. If so, do not waste your days deciding whether you deserve it. None of us deserve rain either, yet it falls where needed and where not. Use what comes to keep someone warm. Feed someone proud enough to pretend he is not hungry. Give a dog a final bed where he is praised for old service. If my children arrive late, be gentle if you can and firm if you must. Shame already speaks loudly in empty rooms. Graham lowered the page for a moment. Snow drifted quietly across June Bennett's stone, settling in the carved letters of "Still with me." He continued. I once taught history. The saddest pattern is not war or greed. It is how quickly people forget those who become inconvenient. Interrupt that pattern. Build a place where being old is not a crime and being loyal is not a reason to be discarded. If there is a wall somewhere, hang June's picture where morning light can find it. She liked sun on her roses. Beneath that was one final line, smaller than the rest. Tell the dog I noticed him first. Graham laughed then, sudden and rough in the cold air, the kind of laugh grief sometimes allows by surprise. Bruno turned his head at the sound and gave a short questioning huff. You have been thanked, Graham said. The Doberman thumped his tail once against the snow. Back at the lodge, work had already begun before any grand announcement. That is how useful people operate. A carpenter from Odessa replaced warped porch boards while humming old country songs. 2 sisters from town scrubbed kitchen cupboards with military discipline. Teenagers fulfilling volunteer hours discovered that stacking donated blankets was harder than posting opinions online. The place smelled of fresh paint, sawdust, coffee, and thawing hope. Graham pinned Harold's letter to a corkboard in the future office, though only the practical half about budgets interested Claire Donnelly. He forgot to mention liability insurance, she said dryly. He trusted you to remember it, Graham replied. Bruno took ownership of the common hall immediately. He inspected each room every morning, nose low, gait dignified, pausing to supervise anyone carrying tools incorrectly. The contractor swore the dog knew which beams were sound. By the second week, donations filled one storage room. Winter coats sorted by size. Boots lined in rows. Canned goods. Dog beds. Leashes. Bags of senior kibble. One parcel arrived anonymously containing 10 knitted blankets and a note that read, for whoever has forgotten what warmth feels like. Another came from Susan Bennett. Inside were framed classroom photographs of Harold beside graduating students from years long past, smiling in chalk dust and fluorescent light. Her note was brief. I would like to help when you are ready to let me. Mark arrived the next day with a pickup truck and no speech prepared. He unloaded lumber in silence for 4 hours and left after asking where more was needed. Graham considered that progress enough. Near month's end, the first residents came before the sign was even installed. A retired machinist sleeping in his car. After rent increases. A widow whose pension no longer reached both medication and heat. A former transit driver with frostbitten pride and nowhere to place it. Alongside them came 2 retired guide dogs, one anxious spaniel, and a German shepherd whose handler had passed the spring before. Bruno met each arrival at the door, sniffed once, then stepped aside if approved. No committee could have improved the system. That evening, after lights dimmed and the kitchen quieted, Graham hung June Bennett's photograph on the east wall of the common hall. At dawn, exactly as Harold promised, sunlight crossed the floorboards and found her smile first. By February, the lodge no longer looked abandoned. It looked needed. Fresh paint warmed the old brick. New handrails lined the front steps. Smoke rose steady from the chimney each morning, carrying the smell of cedar and soup into the cold air. A carved wooden sign stood near the road where travelers could read it even through snow, Bennett House. Beneath the name, in smaller letters, shelter for seniors and service dogs. Cars slowed often. Some came to stare. Many came to help. Inside, life had settled into a rhythm gentler than most institutions ever manage. Breakfast at 7. Medications at 8. Walks when weather allowed. Stories whenever memory opened its door. Graham discovered that managing older people was not unlike police work. Listen first. Speak clearly. Never underestimate stubbornness. Bruno discovered that supervising 6 dogs and 14 residents required constant patrol. He took the duty seriously. Each morning he inspected rooms one by one, accepting scratches behind the ears as payment. In room 3 lived Walter Desjardins, 74, former machinist, who claimed he disliked dogs while secretly keeping biscuits in every pocket. In room 5 stayed Mrs. Eleanor Pike, widowed, elegant even in borrowed slippers, who brushed Bruno's coat while telling him gossip from 1968. In the annex rested 2 retired guide dogs, Maple and June, both slower than memory but still offended by disorder. There was laughter now in hallways that had once echoed empty. Even sorrow, when it visited, removed its boots at the door. Susan Bennett began volunteering twice a week. At first she washed dishes quietly and left before supper. Shame often enters rooms through the service entrance. But people here had suffered enough to recognize remorse when they saw it. Eleanor Pike eventually handed Susan a tea towel and said, "If you are staying, fold properly." It was the nearest thing to welcome she offered anyone. Mark Bennett came on Saturdays with tools and the steady silence of a man rebuilding inwardly while repairing outward things. He fixed window frames, shoveled paths, installed brighter lights in the kennel wing. One afternoon Graham found him kneeling beside the German shepherd whose handler had passed, adjusting a loose latch. "My father liked shepherds," Mark said without looking up. "He wrote that in a letter." Graham nodded. "Then perhaps begin there." They worked side by side after that with fewer words and more usefulness. Claire Donnelly managed finances with the moral intensity of a frontier judge. She rejected vanity projects, approved ramps, negotiated supply contracts, and terrified vendors who attempted charity pricing theater without real discounts. "Good intentions are not legal tender," she told one supplier over speakerphone. Residents adored her. Contractors feared her. Both reactions were sensible. Spring arrived slowly. Snow withdrew into ditches, then memory. Mud season came first, then crocuses pushing through stubborn ground. With thaw came more need. A retired nurse from Sudbury whose landlord sold the building. A former rail worker with early dementia and nowhere safe to forget things. A police Labrador named Murphy after his handler entered long-term care. Bennett House expanded one room at a time because suffering rarely waits for planning permission. Through it all, Harold's photograph hung in the entrance hall beside June's, both framed in simple maple wood. Visitors often paused before them. Some asked if they had funded the place. Graham always answered the same way. "They reminded us what to do." One rainy Thursday, a package arrived with no return address. Inside lay a folded newspaper clipping about the court case, an apology typed on expensive stationery, and a certified check for $200,000 made payable to Bennett House. Signed only, D. Caldwell. Claire examined it as if expecting hidden venom. "Conscience," she said, "is an expensive late fee." Graham accepted the donation after ensuring it carried no conditions. Money, once separated from ego, can still become useful. That evening he told no one who sent it. Some redemptions deserve privacy. Later, after supper, residents gathered in the common hall while rain tapped softly at the windows. Eleanor knitted. Walter pretended not to nap. Susan read aloud from one of Harold's old classroom history notes and made everyone laugh at his dry humor. Mark sat on the floor repairing a chessboard leg while Murphy slept against his boot. Graham looked around the room and felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not triumph. Not relief. Home, perhaps, returning by a road he had stopped watching. Bruno crossed the hall slowly now, age visible in each careful step, and rested his head on Graham's knee. "You did this," Graham whispered. Bruno sighed, the sound deep and content. Sometimes the strongest walls are built not from brick or stone, but from one creature refusing to ignore a knock in the night. Summer came to Bennett House with open windows, long light, and the smell of cut grass drifting in from the road. The maples along the drive had filled out into thick green shade, and the old lodge, once forgotten, now looked like the sort of place memory would choose if given architecture. Raised garden beds stood near the porch where residents grew tomatoes, basil, and arguments. Wind chimes turned lazily beside the entrance. Someone was always watering something. Someone was always healing slower than they admitted. Graham learned that good work does not end when a ribbon is cut. It simply changes clothing. Some days he handled plumbing leaks, medication schedules, and grant paperwork before breakfast. Other days he listened to stories no one had asked people to tell in years. A former railway conductor describing prairie dawns. A widow recalling dance halls in Peterborough. A veteran explaining how silence can become too loud after service ends. He found that loneliness, once invited to speak, often sounded the same in every accent. Bruno no longer made full rounds of the property. Age had negotiated terms with him. His muzzle had gone almost white, and stairs were now approached with strategic patience. But each morning he still stationed himself by the front door at 7 sharp to greet newcomers. Some authority survives the body. Residents trusted his judgment more than intake forms. If Bruno leaned into a stranger's knee, they stayed. If he simply watched, staff paid attention. One humid afternoon in July, a battered hatchback rolled into the drive carrying a woman in her 60s and a thin black Labrador whose eyes had gone cloudy with age. The woman introduced herself as Marianne Cole from Belleville. "This is Porter," she said. "My husband was military police. The dog worked with him until arthritis retired them both." She hesitated, embarrassed by need. "My husband passed in March. Rent did not." Graham nodded toward the porch. "Then you are early for supper and right on time for home." Porter moved slowly from the car, uncertain on the gravel. Bruno crossed the yard one careful step at a time and touched noses with him in solemn greeting. No barking. No display. Just 2 old professionals acknowledging long service. Marianne cried harder at that than she had during the intake interview. Not all kindness comes from people. Susan now managed community outreach with a competence sharpened by regret. She organized volunteers, clothing drives, medical transport, and school visits where teenagers learned that poverty can happen after pensions, after illness, after pride runs out. Mark supervised maintenance and had become unexpectedly patient with everyone except ladders. Claire remained guardian of budgets and enemy of nonsense. When asked why she donated so much time, she replied, "Spite against waste." Yet she never missed the birthday cakes. Harold and June's photographs still hung in the entrance hall, now joined by framed snapshots of residents, handlers, and dogs who had found their final chapter under this roof. Some pictures later received black ribbons in the corner. Bennett House grieved openly and therefore healed more honestly than many places ever do. In late August, the town council presented Graham with a civic medal for service. He accepted it politely, then donated the medal to the children's craft bin where it became part of a papier-mâché lighthouse. "Much improved," Claire said. That evening a thunderstorm rolled across the county, warm rain striking the porch roof in steady applause. Power flickered once, then held. Residents gathered in the common hall with tea and blankets while Porter snored beside the fireplace and Murphy attempted to steal biscuits from Walter's cardigan pocket. Susan read aloud from Harold's old lesson notes again, this time on kindness in history being poorly documented because it leaves fewer monuments. "That sounds like him," she said softly. Graham sat near the window with Bruno's head resting across his boot. The Doberman's breathing was slower now, deeper, touched by the tired rhythm of a long-used engine nearing rest. Graham stroked the white fur between his ears. "You can stand down any time," he whispered. Bruno opened one eye, offended by the suggestion. Lightning flashed beyond the trees, briefly, illuminating the hall. In that blue-white moment, every face looked peaceful. Dogs asleep. People safe. Rain on the roof. No one outside unwanted. Graham understood then that fortune had not arrived as money at all. It had arrived as responsibility accepted in time. Bruno's tail tapped once against the floorboards, then again, like a quiet gavel closing the case. Autumn returned the way wisdom often does, quietly and without asking permission. The maples along the drive blazed red for a week, then let go all at once, covering the path to Bennett House in color bright enough to make even grief pause and admire it. The air sharpened. Mornings carried wood smoke and the first warnings of frost. Inside the lodge, radiators hummed back to duty, soup simmered by noon, and people who once dreaded winter now discussed blanket preferences like royalty. A full year had passed since a stormy night on Maple Street changed the direction of many lives at once. Bennett House had grown beyond the old lodge. A second wing now held 8 more rooms, a small clinic, and a training hall where retired service dogs stretched stiff joints while volunteers learned patient hands. The waiting list remained longer than Graham liked, which is to say it remained real. He had learned there is no ribbon cutting for need. It simply keeps arriving with overnight bags and polite apologies. Susan managed operations now with the calm efficiency of someone trying to repay a debt no ledger could measure. Mark oversaw maintenance crews and had become the sort of man who fixed broken hinges before broken conversations. Claire chaired the board with the expression of a woman daring chaos to try something. It rarely did. Harold and June still greeted everyone from the entrance wall. Fresh flowers appeared beneath their frames more often than anyone admitted placing them there. Bruno no longer greeted newcomers at the door each morning. Age had called him inward. He spent most days on a thick bed beside the common hall fireplace where sun found him through the east windows and residents found excuses to pass by with treats. His hearing had softened, his hips complained openly, and his once sharp bark now came sparingly. But his eyes remained clear. When someone entered carrying fear, he knew. When someone entered carrying kindness, he knew that too. One October evening, rain tapped gently at the windows while residents played cards and argued over rules no one intended to follow. Graham sat on the floor beside Bruno, brushing the white fur along the old dog's neck in slow strokes. "You look tired," he said. Bruno rested his chin on Graham's wrist. It was answer enough. The veterinarian came the next morning, not because crisis had struck, but because love sometimes knows when to become brave. Dr. Lena Morris had treated half the animals in the county and spoke to them all as equals. She examined Bruno carefully, then sat beside Graham in the common hall while sunlight warmed the floorboards. "His heart is failing," she said softly. "He is not in pain now. But he is telling us he is ready soon." Graham nodded once. Men who have worn uniforms often learn to receive hard truths without spectacle. It does not mean they hurt less. Word traveled through the house without anyone announcing it. Residents came one by one throughout the day. Walter brought contraband bacon. Eleanor brushed Bruno's coat until it shone. Susan knelt and thanked him for growling at the right people. Mark scratched behind the ears and whispered an apology for things dogs had never blamed him for. Porter lay beside him in companionable silence. Near dusk, Graham carried Bruno outside wrapped in a wool blanket and settled with him on the front porch swing. The sky over the fields burned gold, then amber, then the deep blue that belongs only to Canadian evenings in late fall. Leaves moved across the yard like old letters being turned over. From inside came the muffled sound of dishes, laughter, life continuing in the rooms behind them. Graham placed one hand over Bruno's chest and felt the slow, faithful rhythm there. "You found them all," he said quietly. "The lost ones. Including me." Bruno opened his eyes once more and looked toward the entrance hall where Harold's photograph hung beyond the glass. Then he looked back at Graham, sighed long in content, and let the breath go as if setting down a burden carried well. The porch stayed very still afterward. No thunder. No grand sign. Only evening settling gently over a house full of people who would sleep warm because an old dog once refused to ignore a stranger in the rain. Days later, a bronze plaque was fixed beside the front door. Visitors touched it on their way in without being told why. It read, "In memory of Bruno, who guarded the truth and opened the gate." Beneath it, in smaller letters, another line had been added by Graham himself. "Some stories do not end in victory. They end in grace."